right, good morning, everyone. Oh, I'm so sorry. It is transcribing me, and I'm going to minimize that. All right, I went ahead and started the recording. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, to the How to Apply Fall 2023. We will have time for questions at the end, and so make sure to go ahead and put any questions you have in the chat. Mute yourself, turn off your video, and we'll go ahead and get started. So this is the Affordable and Special Needs Housing program, How to Apply for the Fall 2023 rental application. So hopefully you are in the right place. There is the How to Apply for Homeownership this afternoon. This is what we're going to walk through today in our time together. We're going to start with some welcome and staff introductions. We have some new people on our team I'd like to introduce you to. We'll do a brief what's ASNH, what's new in 2024, go over the guidelines, application submissions, scoring overview, notification process, and then have time for questions. So before we all turn our camera off on staff, we just wanted to quickly go around and introduce ourselves and say hello. I'm Carly Blake. I'm the rental program manager. I previously served as a program administrator for the team since the fall of 2021, so you may recognize me. And then the rest of the ASNH staff that is on the call will go ahead and say hello as well.
Morning. My name is Chloe Rote. I'm the Associate Director of Affordable Housing at DHCD. Like Carly mentioned, I manage this team and I also manage the home ownership team. So this is relatively new to us. This past spring is the first a separate how to apply for the home ownership process. It's still the same application cycle and funds available, but if that is what you are looking for, there and how to apply specific to that in the afternoon. In the meantime, I will turn introductions over to Elizabeth, who is also new to our team.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Spate. I'm a program administrator with the rental housing team. So excited to be with you all this morning.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jordan Meadows. I'm also a program administrator. I've been here for about 6 months now, so may have worked with some of you, but look forward to working with all of you going forward.
Good morning. My name is Shelby Carney, and I'm also a rental program administrator. I started with DHCD in August.
Great, and that is us. So my team, you can go ahead and turn off your camera, but they will be helping in the chat, keeping track of questions as they come through. And for everyone that is attending today, if you could please put your name and your organization in the chat, as well as if you've applied for ASNH rental funds before. I know we haven't asked this in the past, but we're just curious to kind of see the room of who has maybe done this process before and who hasn't. So if you could go ahead and put that in the chat, that'll help us keep track of who's here today. And let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so for those of you who have not joined us before, and I'm actually going to turn off my camera as well. For those of you who have not joined us before, what's ASNH? The Affordable and Special Needs Housing Program funds the construction or renovation of affordable housing. It is a single competitive application that is ran twice a year. We have 4 sources of funding, which we will talk more about later. And again, we have 2 application cycles annually. We are currently in the fall 2023 of the fiscal year 2024 application. So it's the first round of applications, which will close Friday, October 6th. And then spring tentatively should be February 5th to March 8th. Again, this could change. Any updates will come from CAM's listserv. But as we are slightly moving our dates earlier in the fiscal year, we wanted to go ahead and give you our best estimation of those dates as soon as we could. Okay, so first, what is new for this fiscal year? I wanted to start off and just highlight some of the changes from prior years. Last year, we had a larger change to the program in terms of how we collected application attachments, some of the submission requirements, the narrative questions, and even how we organized the how to apply. So in our guidelines, a lot of things changed last year. But from last year to this year, not a lot has changed. So these are the biggest things that are different. The first is that the permanent supportive housing funds were previously on the consolidated application. This was the $500,000 carve out that was specifically for permanent supportive housing projects. We typically did not award projects that were eligible for this money, any of the other consolidated competitive awards, and vice versa. They are fundamentally different. So this year we thought we would make it a little less confusing and make that its own application. We will have that opening up in the fall. So in terms of the consolidated competitive sources, this is not really the removal of a source that most of these projects would have been eligible for anyways. Then next, our program guidelines. The biggest change to those is that we are standardizing our program agreement and commitment deadlines. This is not a huge shift policy-wise. Previously, our policy was 2 years from signing of a program agreement. We had 2 years from signing a program agreement, they would expire, and then you had a year to sign that program agreement. We're now just standardizing those dates. So it will be a year from application that you must sign a program agreement. So 10/7/2024, we will need all program agreements signed. And those program agreements will expire 2 years from that date, 10/7/2026. We will work with developments as necessary to provide extensions, adjust this as necessary on a case-by-case basis, but this just helps us get these program agreements signed. So when you read the guidelines, it hasn't changed in terms of length of time, but again, it just helps us and you all once you get to that stage to know, when we're expecting things to be completed and help start that conversation if there are updates that need to be made. And the last big change for this fiscal year is that the application instructions are no longer a separate document. If you need instructions for using CAMS, that can be found on the CAMS website portal, and ASNH specific instructions can be found in the program guidelines. So we just added it as either a attachment at the end of the guidelines, or we added some additional narrative to kind of explain some of the questions and requirements for applying, but it's no longer a separate document. We are working on getting our website up and updated, and once that has been updated, you'll see these changes, and then as soon as we have these recordings processed, we will update those on our ASNH website as well. Okay, so next we're going to talk about program guidelines and kind of how our application and program works. These are the different areas that we're going to cover: our funding sources, the project and applicant eligibility, funding limits and restrictions, program requirements, how you will submit, and how you will find out the result of your application. So first, the approximate funds for this fiscal year. So for 2 application rounds, these are our approximate amounts of dollars. For the home program, we have just about $8.5 million. National Housing Trust Fund, almost $7 million. $60 million in Virginia Housing Trust Fund, and $95 million in the High E Fund. We have an asterisk by High E because High E we'll talk more about, but it is a non-competitive source. And so we fund projects as they come in and are eligible for High E. But typically we try to keep our other competitive sources some money for each round. isn't necessarily always an even split, but we do try based on the applications that come in each round to carry over to the spring as well. Now, these amounts all could change, could go up due to program income, but currently these are our approximate fund amounts. Okay, who can apply for ASNH? Nonprofit organizations, for-profit housing developers, public housing authorities, and DHCD certified community development housing organizations, or CHODOs. I want to highlight that what is not on here is a local government and also a legal entity set up to take ownership of the project. So if you have Project Affordable Housing 1 and you are setting up Affordable Housing 1 LLC to collect all of the funds for that project, that is not an eligible applicant. It must be one of these types of organizations. If you have questions about whether or not the organization that you are with that is looking to apply is eligible, please reach out to myself or any of our staff. And then the eligible applicant roles. So who involved in the project can be the applicant for the funds? It can be the owner who holds the valid title to or long-term leasehold interest in the site, the developer who has a contractual obligation to develop the site, a sponsor, which is an owner or partial owner, agrees to convey ownership to a second nonprofit at a predetermined time or at completion. This requires a DHCD consultation prior to application, so please reach out to myself and we will schedule a time to talk. So again, it cannot be the project LLC or legal entity. So essentially, we want the person that is contractually obligated to develop the site or has long-term interest and leasehold on the site. Before I continue, have there been any questions in the chat regarding eligible applicant roles or the funding for this year?
We have one question.
Okay.
So Planning District Commission cannot apply, right?
I will just double check with Chloe on that. Chloe?
That's correct, Lori Jean. Planning district commissions are considered a unit of local government, and so they are not eligible. However, if you have a project that you are interested in pursuing, please reach out to Carly or myself, and we can talk through the way to set up an eligible application.
Great, thank you, Chloe. Okay, and then the applicant requirements must be the primary partner in the project, must be the entity responsible for long-term operations and compliance, and must be free of outstanding audit or compliance issues. Okay, so that was who can apply. Now I want to talk about the types of projects that we can fund. So again, ASNH does fund rental and home buyer projects, but it must be rental or home buyer. You must come in separately for a rental project and a home buyer project. We require a minimum of 5 units, which has to be at 80% AMI, area median income, or below. We can fund projects that include market rate, but again, we'll just need to see the minimum of 5 units targeted at that low income household level. You must be eligible for each of the sources that you request at the time of your application. So we'll talk more about source specific requirements, but just know that when you submit your application for, say, all of our sources of funding, you must be eligible for all of those sources of funding at the time of the application. We can fund new construction, substantial renovation, and adaptive reuse. We can fund common ownership management financing. So those 9 deals, those need to be separate projects. If you have an entity set up for your 9% LIHTC project, that needs to be its own application, and same for those 4% deals. And if you're doing a rehabilitation, it's a minimum investment of $15,000 a unit in 3 or more major systems. You can find more information about those rehabilitation standards in our guidelines. And finally, we do allow the funding of SROs and scattered sites, but we do recommend that you have a consultation with us ahead of time just to make sure that our definitions line up of what an SRO is and making sure that it would still be eligible for our funding. Okay. The next thing I wanted to talk about, which is slightly different on our end, but that is due to some programmatic changes that we had worked through over the summer. But in terms of applying, nothing has changed. So our request caps for a project is $700,000 for each source. So home, National Housing Trust Fund, or Virginia Housing Trust Fund. The maximum project request and maximum that you can request at all time for a project for that source is $700,000 unless you have eligible PSH units, which we'll talk more about. Then it can be $900,000 per source. And for high E, it is a maximum of $2 million or 10% of the total improvement cost for the project. And that is a calculation that your application workbook will take care of. So whichever is the lower amount is the request that you can have for high E. And so the thing that is slightly different is that we have award caps of maximum per project. Again, this is at DHCD's sole discretion to fund a project in its entirety, regardless of the sources that were applied. So the maximum award without high E that a project could receive from DHCD is $2.1 million. Again, if they're eligible for home, National Housing Trust Fund, and Virginia Housing Trust Fund, again, eligible and applied for those sources. And then $2.4 million is the maximum award for a project that will have those eligible PSH units. And then with high E, 4.1 and 4.4 if it is a eligible PSH project. So again, what this means is nothing has changed in terms of how you apply. The caps are the same for requesting each source by project. So if you are coming back in for a project that has already received $700,000 of any of those sources, you cannot come in and request more for that same source unless there has been a change to say include PSH units. And so you would need to be eligible at time of application for all of those sources, same as every round before. What has changed is that, again, DHCD will have the discretion to fully fund a project. As you know, since I've been here in fiscal year 22, the amount of Virginia Housing Trust Fund, home, National Housing Trust Fund wasn't that stark of a difference to each other. And as we know, we have significantly increased the amount of Virginia Housing Trust Fund that we have for the program, which is really awesome. But for projects that are coming in, scoring really high and requesting all 3 competitive sources, it can be hard for us to award those high scoring projects the full amount that they need to move forward with their project. So what this will allow is for us to have the discretion that as an application comes in for a project that is really close to closing on construction, beginning construction, and will be completed rather soon, it gives us the discretion to be able to fully fund that request. So to meet that 2.1 with maybe Virginia Housing Trust Fund or a different combination of those eligible sources to get to the amount that that project needs. So again, nothing has changed on the side of the applicant. You still need to be eligible for the sources of which you apply, and we will talk more about those requirements in the coming slides. So this is the required income targeting for each of those sources, as I mentioned. So for Virginia Housing Trust Fund and High E, those income targetings need to be at 80% the area median income or below. And then the home is 60% or below for at least 5 projects, and 20% of those must be at 50% or below. Then for National Housing Trust Fund, it is a targeting of 30% or below. And again, it is a minimum of 5 units required. However, based on the application request, up to 11 may be requested as floating by DHCD. And what that means is you may come in with a project that has 100 units and maybe all 100 may be at 60% or below, but what DHCD will contractually ask for is a number between 5 and 11 as our floating units for that 30-year affordability period. So again, these are the requirements. We need to see these on your application workbook and that underwriting to show, the targeting that you plan to have and the rents that you plan to collect based on these requirements. Again, minimum of 5 per source. So your 5 for home cannot be your 5 for National Housing Trust Fund, vice versa. They need to be a separate carve out of 5, at least 5 per source. Do I have any questions about this so far before I move on? All right. So next is the period of affordability. We require at least 30 years of affordability. The National Housing Trust Fund requires 30, Virginia Housing Trust Fund and High E require 30, and home, it has its own requirements federally of either 20 or 15, depending on if it's new construction or rehabilitation, but we have added an extended Virginia compliance to get that to be 30. So all of our sources are a minimum of 30 years of affordability, 30 years of repayment. And you'll see in the narrative questions, we've added some language to allow for you to request a longer term, as long as it is to be coterminous with the first mortgage. So frequently we get applicants that come in that have a first mortgage with Virginia Housing and their terms are slightly longer than ours. And we are happy to extend those based on our conversations. Again, case by case, we'll discuss it, but we are happy to be coterminous with that first mortgage to make everything easier. Okay, and so what is the type of assistance that our loans provide? So these are low interest, deferred principal, permanent loans. You can this year request down to as low as 0% interest for Virginia Housing Trust Fund, but they are typically 3% interest loans. High E is always 0%. It has to be 0%. That is in our guidelines. But the others, we do, again, allow you in your narrative to request a lower than 3% interest rate. And we do highly recommend that you take advantage of the request that we will, again, review on a case-by-case basis. But including that in your application allows us to either approve or deny a request for a reduced interest rate at the same time of announcement of funding. There are interest payments only required over the full affordability period. So these are not cash flow loans. And important to note that these are not construction disbursements. They come in at permanent conversion only. And they are secured by a second lien position and a deed of trust. So in your order of liens on the project, DHCD requires a second lien position, and we will sign a deed of trust right at the end of that permanent conversion and ultimately closing on our loans. All right, so that is kind of an overview of what is in our first half of our guidelines. The next part, we're going to talk about more specific programmatic requirements. So I'm just going to look at the chat here and see if there are any questions that we've had so far that I can touch on before we move forward. Okay, I see a question about the floating units. So our floating units are a max of 11 for any of the sources. 20% of the units, that applies to of your home income targeted units. So of those 5 to 11 units that are specifically set aside as floating units for home, 20% of those have to be at the 50% AMI. And so if you have any more than 5 units, it is 2 of those 50%. And if you are only requested 5, it will be 5 at 60% and 1 at 50%. So hopefully that answers that question. Okay, I see a question here about the lien position that local governments often require to also be in the second lien position. Is there flexibility? We can discuss that on a case-by-case basis once you have been awarded. We are happy to have that discussion. We have moved lien positions based on the locality requirements in their program agreements / terms agreements. So again, you'll just have that discussion with your program administrator, but typically moving us back in the lien order behind a local government can definitely be considered. All right.
Also, Carly, does home have a per unit cap?
Yes. Home does have a per unit cap. We do that. We take care of that calculation when we sign our program agreements, but typically because of the per source caps that we have, it has taken care of having any issues with that. The only time we start to get kind of close to that per unit cap is if there's some local home dollars with our state home dollars and the units are 1 bedrooms or efficiencies. But again, we look at that when we're approving funding as to make sure that we're not going over those current limits, but those limits are on HUD's site, and we include them when we do our subsidy review in our program agreements. All right. So next, we're going to talk about some more specific programmatic requirements. All of these things can be found in the program guidelines. We're going to talk a little bit about home requirements, high E requirements, permanent supportive housing requirements, 504, and additional requirements and regulations that we have to follow. Okay, so first are the home requirements. So if you apply for home funds, again, we require that you are eligible for the source of which you apply at the time of application. And if you and your organization and the project are in an entitlement or consortium area, which is in Appendix A of our guidelines, there is a required match for those projects, and it does need to be committed at time of application. So if you have questions about match, please feel free to reach out to myself and we can have a conversation. We can look to make sure the documentation you have of the match does indeed make you eligible for these funds. And this is, again, only in those entitlement areas that are in Appendix A of the guidelines. We do have a scoring preference for non-entitlement and CHODO involvement. So if you've applied in the past, you may have seen that you received 2 scores. We score home applications slightly different that we do the other applications, and that is only because these preferences apply just to the home dollars. So every application, we'll talk more about this in the scoring section of the presentation, but every application that comes in for National Housing Trust Fund and Virginia Housing Trust Fund starts out at a 10, we give everyone those points. And then for home, we do have the extra preference for a project that has CHODO involvement or is not in an entitlement area. This is because of HUD's requirements again. So this is something that you can find on the HUD Exchange if you have more questions about where this requirement came from. But we have to have a specific funding set aside for CHODO projects specifically. We'll talk more about CHODO in a moment. Also, home requires an environmental review with a public notice before any choice limiting activities can occur. And the way we know that we have satisfied this requirement is that we receive HUD site approval. So you all may be familiar, maybe not, with the environmental review and Part 58 process, but every project that receives home dollars must go through that process, run a FONSI notice, which is a notice in the local paper letting the public know that there are federal dollars going into a project. We have an environmental review period. The federal government has an environmental review period for the project. And then after that, and only after that, do we receive HUD site approval, and then those choice limiting activities can begin to occur. Okay, and then CHODOs. So these are DHCD certified through CAMS. If you do not have an approved project for CHODO in CAMS, then you are not a DHCD certified CHODO. You may be certified at a local level, but you have to be certified at our level prior to applying. There is an application that is always open in CAMS. There are guidelines on that that kind of explain and describe how you can become eligible as a CHODO, and I am happy to talk to anyone that has questions about getting their CHODO certification. But for the purposes of this fall round, if you are not a certified CHODO, by the time of application closing on October 6th, you will not receive those points for home funding. And the CHODO requirements have to continually be met through involvement, public involvement in the process of the development. And so you'll see these questions in our application asking about what involvement did you have with the public in this project. And so if you, we are looking for this for every project, but specifically as a CHODO, if you come in as a CHODO and you do not have a satisfactory plan or response to this narrative question, that may have some issues with your actual CHODO certification. And it does require an annual recertification for every year that you receive home funds. So if your organization was a CHODO certified organization last year and you apply this year for more home funds and you receive those home funds on a project, we will reach out to you about your recertification, and that must be completed in CAMS before we can sign any program agreements for that additional set aside of CHODO funds. CHODO related funds. Are there any questions so far about either home requirements or these CHODO certification requirements? Let me check in the chat. All right, thank you, Jordan, for sharing that link. There is also in CAMS a CHODO application that you can view, and there's a PDF that is like the application workbook that will really guide you and show you what you need if you are looking to get that CHODO certification. I am the person that reviews those applications. So again, if you have a question or are looking to recertify or certify your organization, please reach out to me and I'm happy to answer any questions you have so that you can get those in as soon as you can. All right, great. We're going to move on. So next are the high E performance requirements. And what I will start by saying is that Appendix B has a lot more information around what is required to receive high E dollars. So if beyond this presentation you have more questions, please look at Appendix B and then reach out, and we can especially reach out with your specific questions. I myself am not an environmental efficiency expert, but we do have people on staff that are, and we will do our best to get you the right answers. But what I can say here today is that we do have requirements and they are in our guidelines. And for new construction, we do have a green building certification required and zero energy ready homes. So it is important to note that just the Energy Star certification is not sufficient. And it is really important that you look at the guidelines of what we require because it is different and stricter than maybe some other programs you've applied to that require these energy efficiency standards. For substantial rehabilitation, there's a green building certification required, an average HERS index of 70 or below across all units, or 40% improvement in HERS index. For an adaptive reuse, again, green building certification is required and an average HERS index of 80 or below across all units. This is, again, really important that you review this if you are applying for high E, because you must be eligible and have all the documentation required for high E on your application to receive high E. So we can't approve high E conditionally. You must apply as an eligible project with all the required documentation that you can find in Appendix B and on the application in CAMS. Chloe, is there anything around high E that I missed that you may want to add?
Sure. I will add just one additional thing, and that is that our funds do come in at permanent conversion. One piece of the closing index that is unique for high E is that we have to have the final certifications to show that you are meeting the performance standards. So when you apply for high E funding, what you attach to your application are those preliminary certifications. And then prior to closing, one of the items that is required for us to be able to remit this funding is certification of each of the energy efficiency requirements being met as the building as built at completion. So that's just something to keep in mind. In most cases, permanent conversion happens, quite a bit after initial lease up. And so it's not has not yet been an issue to convert and have these documents ready. But I know in talking to a few different developers over the past couple of weeks, those final as-built green build certifications can take a little bit longer to have completed. So just keep that in mind as you are building out your timeline for closing.
Great, thank you for adding that. All right, do we have any questions in the chat? I'm going to take just a second to check in here. I'm not seeing anything, so we'll go ahead and continue on. The next thing I wanted to cover is the permanent supportive housing scoring preference. There is an additional 5 points that we award for projects that have qualified permanent supportive housing. And there's also up to an additional $400,000 that you can receive for that project if, again, you have that eligible permanent supportive housing. Please refer to our program guidelines, and also we updated the narrative question to be a little bit more clear in what we are looking for this requirement. There is a minimum number or percentage of units that you must have in the project if you're claiming permanent supportive housing, so make sure you review those guidelines and requirements. The most important thing that we need for scoring is an MOU with a referring agency. This is required at time of application to receive those points. The compliance is not identical to Virginia Housing's LIHTC program. So saying that you are following the LIHTC permanent supportive housing requirements does not make you necessarily eligible for this carve out of funds and these extra 5 points. We are really looking for a MOU with a referring agency. So whether that's your local continuum of care, DSS, your local community services board, whatever it may be that you're connecting with, the organization that is going to refer those households to your permanent supportive housing units, we do need that on your application at time of application. If you have questions about whether or not the documentation you have is what will make you eligible, please let me know. Send me an email. I'm happy to talk to you about that. But this is really important, that just including the documentation required for LIHTC to meet that requirement is not necessarily meeting our requirement. If you do have what we need on a permanent supportive housing set aside project, again, you get that scoring preference of 5 extra points in the needs section and up to $400,000 increased. There's more information in program guidelines and in the narrative. So please reach out if you have any further questions of that. And also I just wanted to note that this is not a change from prior years and how we scored applications. We just really wanted to reinforce it, as we know LIHTC's requirements have changed. So just wanted to highlight that ours are indeed different and have not changed to this point. Okay, another requirement on your application is the Section 504 accessibility minimum amounts. This is on rentals, new construction, and substantial alterations. We need to see 5% of your units set aside 504 mobility impairment units, as well as 2% for sensory impairments. It's a minimum of 1 per, and again, it's that 5% and 2%. You will have the opportunity to enter these numbers on your application workbook. So please make sure you've filled that out. And also there's a narrative question regarding these 504 accessibility requirements. So please be as detailed in what the work you're doing to fulfill this requirement as you can. Other alterations, this requires accessibility to a maximum extent feasible, may not require the full 5%. But this can affect your score. And so we would like for you to consult with us prior to submission. We recommend that just so we can make sure that you know what we're looking for in terms of scoring. We do score based on meeting the qualifications and then also exceeding qualifications. So a lot of times we'll see applications come in with more than required, and that again is priority. And then also any universal design in your project, please be specific as to if you're utilizing that in the development of your project. I just want to reinforce that it is very strict for new construction and that your substantial alterations require this to the maximum extent feasible. So please, if you have questions around that, reach out. If you're wondering if what you're doing meets these requirements, as they are slightly different when you are doing those alteration projects. Okay. Then there are a few additional requirements and regulations that we have. These are federal or state. They're always in our guidelines, so please reference our guidelines for more information, or the DHCD website has more information about all of these policies and regulations. All the developments must comply with the Fair Housing Act. It must be lead-safe housing. This is in your application workbook. There's a tab related to this. Every project must comply with the Uniform Relocation Act, even if it is a new construction that is not causing relocation. We do require that you acknowledge the Uniform Relocation Act in your application. Then there are Section 3 labor standards, Davis-Bacon regulations. Again, all this information is on our website and in our guidelines. Davis-Bacon, specifically, this is why we do not ask for more than 11 floating units, because 12 triggers Davis-Bacon regulations, which has some additional compliance around it that we as an agency do not do. So please refer to the program guidelines for any additional information about those requirements. We also in our guidelines have information around what we consider eligible costs in your underwriting, the rent limits and increases, the leasing requirements, and other things of note for when you are applying for our program. I wanted to specifically highlight the rent limits and increases. HUD provides us with the rent limits for each locality. It is for National Housing Trust Fund and home for those AMI targeted units, and that is on HUD's website. So if you have questions about whether or not the rents that you are planning to submit with your application match those, I would suggest going to HUD's website. We have it linked in our guidelines. You can find it there. And because this becomes an issue if you apply for a project with certain targeting and those rents exceed the limits, we're either going to need to be seeing some subsidies, some vouchers included on the project that can explain those discrepancies, or we may require that you revisit your underwriting and submit a new workbook before we can give out any program agreements. So again, all of this information is in our guidelines. I recommend you look over it every time you apply. And again, there's more information about DHCD specific policies around these regulations on DHCD's website as well. I'm just going to pause to see if there are any questions that have not been answered.
I'm going to chime in real quick on Section 3. Section 3 reporting requirements were changed, I believe at the end of 2021, it's HUD. So at the end of 2021 and then throughout the early part of 2022, there was some back and forth around guidance to participating jurisdictions on Section 3 reporting for contracts that are executed this year, last fiscal year and this year moving forward. The Section 3 reporting guidelines is across the lifetime of the construction of the project. So previously we had in CAMS some automatic reporting that was annual post award, but that is no longer necessary. Project reporting for Section 3 compliance is at the end of the construction period before we certify the project as completed. And we have been working internally on some new reporting guidelines for that. So we will be in touch with projects that have to report out on Section 3 to talk through what is required to be reported to DHCD. And then we are responsible for reporting across all projects that we fund with federal funds up to HUD. Does that answer your question, Eric?
Yes, thank you very much. That was excellent.
Great, thanks, Chloe. All right, let's move on to application submission. Our deadline is 11:59 on October 6th, 2023. So this is Friday, October 6th. At the end of that day, CAMS will close. You cannot submit your application. We do not allow for post-close submission. If your documents are missing, your documents are missing. Unfortunately, please do not send any attachments by email. They must all be in CAMS. If you encounter technical issues, please reach out to the CAMS help system in the portal. And once you have done that, if you still are having issues, please email myself. I'll do the best I can to connect you with that support person to get any issues resolved. But again, we have a hard cutoff of October 6, 2023 at 11:59 p.m. Again, it includes all required materials. If you are missing required materials, it may make your project ineligible completely, or may result in you losing points where you may have been able to receive them had your attachments been included. Once it closes, our team begins our scoring process. There is a panel review for the eligibility and completeness. We score all eligible projects, and then they are ranked. Projects must receive at least 60 points to be eligible for funding. And high E is competitive and awarded as eligible. So again, it is a minimum of 60 points to be eligible for funding. That does not mean you will be funded. And high E is non-competitive, but you must receive a competitive source to receive high E. So if you score and receive a competitive source, so Virginia Housing Trust Fund, National Housing Trust Fund, or home, as we have high E, you will receive high E. Again, it's non-competitive, but you must receive a competitive source. I wanted to highlight the application workbook. This was new the last fiscal year. It has not fundamentally changed, but we've made some minor updates to fix formulas, to add a couple extra questions in there for completeness. But it combines documents that were on projects submitted, applications submitted prior to fiscal year 2023. So if you haven't applied since then, it is a different document, but it combines the application packet, project timeline, underwriting templates, site neighborhood standards review, and some other required documentation. It is all in one workbook. If you have questions about the workbook, please reach out to myself. I can help kind of fix some of the quirks that may come up. You'll notice that some of the cells are locked, and that is because they automatically calculate information in other cells. So if you run into some issues with formulas not working, cells not working, please reach out to me and I'll do the best I can to fix it. But the application workbook is pretty intensive, but again, it covers a lot of old documents that maybe weren't as user-friendly. But this is required for your application, as are all the required application attachments per our guidelines. But this one is probably one of the most important, as it spells out the specifics of your project timeline, your total development costs. It shows us your eligibility for the high E carve out that you've requested, because it will automatically calculate your eligible high E amount. So please, if you have any questions, reach out to myself or one of the program administrators. I would suggest reaching out to myself or Jordan, as it has been around a little bit longer and seen the workbook. But again, we are happy to help fix any quirks that you have, and this is a really important attachment for your application. And I just wanted to pause before I continued because I saw some questions being answered in the chat. And I just wanted to make sure that Chloe has been able to answer the questions so far.
Sure, I believe that we've covered it.
Okay.
The primary things I think related to Section 3 and Davis-Bacon, and just to go back to some things Carly mentioned previously, particularly for home, which is our sort of where everyone is familiar with Davis-Bacon reporting from. Davis-Bacon is reporting based on wage guidelines, among a few other things. And if a project receives federal funding, home funding, and has fewer than 12 home assisted units, that is not a Davis-Bacon trigger. That's the primary reason that we look for somewhere between 5 to 11 home assisted units in a development, to alleviate that reporting burden on both the developer and on DHCD. That is a separate requirement from Section 3 reporting. Section 3 reporting is an independent guideline from HUD around wage reporting, but also around minority and women-owned businesses reporting. That is independent. So a project can be required to do Section 3 reporting, even if they do not trigger Davis-Bacon. And then we had another question around a high E only application. For a project to apply for high E, they have to have been awarded a competitive source, Virginia Housing Trust Fund, Home, or National Housing Trust Fund. That award can occur simultaneously. So you could, as a developer, apply in this open fall round right now for example, home funds and high E funds. You can be awarded those in the same round. If your project has already secured a Virginia Housing Trust Fund, Home, or National Housing Trust Fund award in a previous round, you can come in for a high E only award allocation because you've already secured that competitive source. You do still have to complete a full application, and you do have to provide that additional high E like supporting documentation to show that your project as designed will meet the energy efficiency requirements. Jen, we will clarify. DHCD is still having some conversations. Jen asked if only home awards are required to do Section 3 reporting. DHCD is coming up with an internal policy around Section 3 reporting. That is something that we've been sort of going back and forth with the HUD requirements and sort of what is the easiest for DHCD to administer across the board, because we have projects that do home only, we have projects that do home and National Housing Trust Fund. So we will be in touch in the next about 60 days with some training around what will be required for Section 3 reporting. So we'll make sure that we touch base on that with you. And that will be true of projects that were previously funded as well, because this guidance around Section 3 reporting and the change in sort of the structure of that reporting is something that the final rule was issued relatively recently. And that is still something that we are getting clarification on from HUD. And I'm sorry, that's like clear as mud, but we will be in touch with projects that are affected.
Great, thank you. All right. So we're going to continue on with the application submission and review process. Next, I want to cover generally how we score applications. So we score based on 3 areas: need, feasibility, and developer capacity, each with their own set aside of points. The first is the need section. This part of your application is really critical that you best answer the narrative questions for us to be able to score the needs section of your application. We will also look at your attachments, so please have all the required attachments around market studies and things of that nature that are required. But this helps us look and see how your project will fill a critical need in that market area. This is where our PSH projects can receive an extra 5 points. And there is, for the home scoring only, the non-entitlement extra 5 points. So in this area, you can get an additional 5 points for PSH in both your home and housing trust fund scores. And then for home only, it's the extra 5 points for non-entitlement and non-consortium localities. The next section is feasibility. Again, we're going to really look at your narrative here, your timeline, your attachments related to the sources that you have committed to the project. And this helps us look at whether or not your project demonstrates the ability to come to a timely completion. So you'll look in our guidelines, and we are looking for projects that are starting construction within the next 12 months. That's kind of our bar, but we do look at projects that are going to potentially start construction in the next 6 months or even sooner, and take that into consideration as we're scoring. Again, this is important for you to let us know which sources you plan to apply for, which sources you have applied for, and which sources you have committed, because this will affect your feasibility score in the sources we are able to fund you with. And then finally, we score on developer capacity. The applicant is able to demonstrate through their narrative responses and attachments that your development team has the ability to successfully complete projects and deliver affordable housing. And this is where for home awards only, we give those extra 5 CHOTO points. I just want to touch on the developer capacity section that we have many narrative questions that you will use to tell us about the partners that are in this project and the experience in development. We do not, disqualify anyone for maybe this being a first project of theirs, but what we're really looking for is the capacity. And so if you're a smaller organization that maybe is working with some consultants, if you're working with another organization that has more experience, if you have a rental management company that's going to come in that maybe we've heard of before or not, including all of those players in the project and the experience that you may have in things related are definitely important to include in your application. We do look at this on a application by application basis. And I also want to note that in terms of scoring down in the section, it is usually something that we have had a conversation with developers about prior to applying if there are maybe some issues that we have experienced in this capacity section. So again, really utilizing the narrative questions, providing us with answers to the questions that we're specifically asking for, being pretty concise and not leaving off any application attachments will be crucial in being awarded dollars and winning those points. Are there any questions in the chat around scoring overview so far?
No questions in the chat.
Great, thank you. Then for the high E criteria, as I mentioned, this is not a competitive source. You either are eligible for high E or you are not. And if you are requesting high E funds, you must first be scored and ranked as achieving an award of a competitive source. So you must either in this round be receiving Virginia Housing Trust Fund, National Housing Trust Fund, or HOME, or previously have received one of those sources to be eligible for high E. And if you are eligible for high E, and we have the high E dollars, your project will be awarded the high E dollars that the project is eligible for. We must, in your application, have all the documents required, and it must demonstrate that you achieve the minimum performance requirements. Again, you want to have all your attachments uploaded that are required for this. Just simply saying that it planned to have these certifications is not enough. We do need to see that you have been given a preliminary certification for your project. Okay, and then once you have submitted and we have scored, it comes the notification process of award. DHCD and the ASNH team makes recommendations to the Office of the Governor for who we think should receive funds. We provide recommendations and the official announcement and award comes from the Office of the Governor. So if we have not received a press release from the governor stating who has received funds, DHCD staff, ASNH staff cannot speak to whether or not a project will receive funding. If you reach out to us and you ask us about your funding, you will probably definitely receive a statement that we send to everyone that asks that same question, letting you know that the next announcement will come from the Office of the Governor. It is typically a press release, and it comes from the governor's office. Once the office has announced the awards for that round, we will send out an email to the project's primary contact as listed in CAMS with a notification of funding or a denial of funding. It is really important that you keep your CAMS profile and the contacts up to date, as we only send these out through email and only to the project primary contact. So please, as you apply, as you submit, and as time goes on, you are looking at your CAMS account and making sure that the people listed as primary contacts are indeed the primary contacts for the project. In terms of your application, we cannot go in and change the primary contact's information. You must do that. So please reach out if you're having any issues. And again, we can connect you with the right person on the CAMS team to help you correct that, but they come out only by email and only to the project primary contact. Okay, and then once you've received the announcement of award, we will then reach out with a terms letter. You have seen the terms letter if you've applied in the past. It is a letter letting you know the amount of the source that you are receiving, the interest rate, whether your request for reduced was approved, that interest rate will be in there. And again, just some of our basic terms that do not change typically will be in that letter for you to sign. We have started, if you were awarded in the spring, you experienced this, and we will continue to do this. But post signing a terms letter, we do require that you have a conversation with your assigned program administrator. We did not previously do that, and that is because there were not enough people on our team to meet that need. And now I'm so happy to say that I have 3 program administrators and myself and Chloe in the associate director role, that there are all hands on deck to kind of have these conversations post signing those terms letters, just to make sure if there are any adjustments that need to happen to our program agreements in those negotiable terms, that we have those before we draft program agreements. Again, if you were awarded this spring, you may have seen or heard about the confirmation of loan terms document. This is a tool for us to guide a conversation with you post-award and terms letter to ensure that your project hasn't changed, and if there are anything that has changed in that negotiable portion of the program agreement, that we cover those bases before we draft and send program agreements out to be signed. Again, this really just helps because you submit an application at one point in your project, and by the time we have awarded, time has passed. So we want to make sure that if you plan to use a back-to-back structure, that we know that ahead of time. If you need to have our terms be coterminous with your first mortgage, that we know that. If there's been an update to the legal name of the project, or a creation of an LLC for purposes of project ownership and financing, that we have all that information before we draft those program agreements. And that is because our program agreements are standardized across the program, and we make as few changes to them as possible. So again, once you receive an award, sign your terms letter. You'll have a conversation with your assigned program administrator to make sure we have all the information that we need. Or, as we have here at bullet 2, we are getting your Part 58s. We are doing your environmental checklist for National Housing Trust Fund dollars. We need to make sure that we have all of those things moving, being coordinated, because you must have a program agreement signed within 12 months of application. So as we mentioned earlier, those program agreements need to be signed by October 7th, 2024. So we will be reaching out again post terms letter to just make sure you know what federal requirements around environmental reviews we need to meet, and any other questions we have so we can get those program agreements signed. We Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, these program agreements expire and always have expired 2 years from signing. And again, we have just standardized that date to kind of encourage signing your program agreements as soon as you are able to. And prior, it may have been an incentive to wait to sign because that clock would start, but we're standardizing it. So it is, encouraged to sign your program agreement as you are ready and you are in receipt of them. Again, those expire 2 years from that date. So 10/7/2026. This is when we expect that you will be complete with construction and ready to go to that permanent conversion. On a case-by-case basis, we will have conversations. If there's an one-time extension required, we can do that. But again, this is standard and this is how our program agreements have always been written. We're just standardizing those dates so that we can keep better track of where projects should be based on their program agreements. So again, we need those signed within 12 months, which means all of those federal environmental review requirements must also be completed as soon as possible. If you've already conducted a Part 58, we encourage you to include that on your application so that we can very speedily review and run that FONSI and get that authority to use grant funds site approval from HUD as soon as we can, because that is a process that takes at least a month, if not longer. So go ahead and submit those on your applications if you have them, because we need program agreements signed by 10/7/2024. Okay, that is all I have for the standard presentation. Now, I'm going to open it up for any questions that maybe haven't been answered so far. I would still encourage you to enter them in the chat, just because there are about 60 people on the call. So if you have any questions, generally, please go ahead and put those in the chat. If you have more project-specific questions, I encourage you to reach out to myself or Jordan to schedule a pre-application call. We are happy to talk more specifically about your project during those conversations. Once you've gotten a chance to go into CAMS, start your application, you have any questions, want to get those answered for you. This recording will be on the website as soon as we can get that processed, along with the updates to the guidelines. They are currently not on the website. They are in CAMS, and you do need to have a CAMS profile to apply. So if you have not gone ahead and done that, please go ahead and get registered in CAMS. You'll see the guidelines there. And again, please reach out to myself if you have any questions around anything that we've discussed today.
So I see one question from Brian Goggin about high E funds, and I am happy to speak to that. When we said earlier in the presentation that we had $95 million of high E funds that were allocated to the ASNH program this year, those funds are fully allocated to the program and would not be decommitted or clawed back. And the same is true of previously executed contracts or previously awarded high E funds. Essentially, the way the high E program has always been structured to work within ASNH is that the quarterly auctions occur, and after 2 to 3 auction cycles, those funds are allocated as like quote special funds within the budget to DHCD and then are allocated further into the program. So those funds that we have, the 95 million, they are already received from auctions. They have been delivered from Treasury to DHCD, and those contracts from previous rounds or this fiscal year will be honored. What I can say about post fiscal year 2024 is that there is some funding remaining because there was an auction from Reggie last week, and there will be another one in December. So there are still some funds being receipted in, even if we do withdraw as of December of this year. However, we are entering a new budget negotiation process, and so it is possible, similar to the Hurley flood carve out that occurred in fiscal year 23, It is possible that funds would be reallocated by the General Assembly and not available in fiscal year 25, so the fall 24 round. That's something that we simply can't know because the biennial budget hasn't been even pre-filed yet. But any funds that are awarded during FY24 will be contractually honored. And Chase asked if site control is a threshold requirement to apply for ASNH. I can say that application is open. Anyone can apply at any time for any project. Generally, folks apply with pretty well-baked projects. All projects are scored competitively. So if you're thinking through our scoring process, while site control might not be a threshold requirement, it is unlikely that a project without site control, and that could be a purchase and sale agreement, not executed ownership as of yet. A project without site control is unlikely to score very highly, just due to sort of the nature of that property.
Thanks, Chloe. And I also wanted to share that, earlier we talked about how we have adjusted how we are able to award to prioritize fully meeting the ask of a project. And again, we noted that that's due to the increase of Virginia Housing Trust Fund dollars versus the amount of federal sources that we have. We are just beginning to look at how long-term this will affect applying and funding our program. And I just wanted to say that we plan to hold input sessions at either the last week of January or the first week of February. All of that information will be shared through CAMS about those info sessions. So keep a lookout for that if you are interested in giving input about program design and improvement. Again, just because we want to do the best we can to get projects across that finish line of funding so that they can quickly move to construction and completion. So again, something that we're looking into and are trying to be intentional about our changes, but also recognizing that we have to make some changes based on the types of sources, the amount of sources that we have, and just the amount of projects that come in each round. So I just wanted to say that you'll hear more about that end of January, early February. Are there any other questions? The chat is open. Also, if you are unable to chat because you're like on the phone and you'd like to unmute yourself, just being aware of other people that may also do the same thing, but I'll give you the opportunity to go ahead and unmute if you have any questions. I'm looking at this question here in the chat.
I'm going to take Eric Hoffman's question because
Yes.
not everyone has had the delightful pleasure of meeting Eric. Eric will be the first one to tell you that he prides himself on either being the annoying little brother or the annoying big brother or the annoying middle cousin. Whoever was the impertinent asker of questions around your family holiday table, Eric would like to wear that crown professionally. He is Nick's correct. It is always annoying, but generally well-intentioned, and I don't mind fielding the question. Eric is on the board of the Virginia Housing Alliance and leads the charge with planning the Housing Credit Conference and Housing Virginia's Most Vulnerable Conference, which occurs next week. I have the pleasure of serving on the Calypso committee planning that conference alongside him. We do not go through Eric's funding conference spreadsheet to determine who gets ASNH funding. Primarily when we are looking at developer capacity, We don't look at involvement in the Virginia process in particular, but we are looking at the past participation tab of the workbook, the application workbook. So we are assessing both past use of our program, past use of other programs. So we've had a number of like 4% developers who did not previously need gap funding, but due to changes in sort of the credit market and overall interest rates have had increased gaps in projects. And so I've started to come in and apply for gap funding from DHCD. So we are looking at overall past participation or past performance of a developer. And for a developer that has previously developed properties either in Virginia with the LIHTC program or in Virginia with DHCD, we do look at ongoing compliance with those properties in terms of timely delivery, making sure that properties are well kept. That's sort of the compliance and audit findings that we utilize in our panel scoring. And so broadly speaking, we score up projects that have participated well or development teams that have participated well with similar funding programs, but that's not necessarily Virginia specific. Certainly the development landscape in Virginia has changed, and we've had more multi-state developers start to expand into our state. And if a developer has mostly developed in Maryland, for example, but is very well reviewed and has significant positive compliance in other states, we would not say, well, you haven't done it here, because predominantly the federal programs and even state assistance are generally similar. And Nick, I can confirm a twinned 9-4 deal. They are independent entities, right? So your 4% deal is going to apply and your 9% deal is going to apply. Those will be separate applications. Your workbook will be separate as well. So when you talk about in your underwriting workbook, the number of units that are in your deal, you'll want to be specific to either the 9 or the 4% side. In the narrative section, if there are amenities that are shared, property level services that are shared, those sorts of things, you can, of course, refer to the project as a whole. But when we are looking at like 504 compliance, when we are looking at percent of units that are under universal design, the number of units that are necessary to be eligible for home or National Housing Trust Fund awards, those are independent for the 9 versus the 4 project. Does that answer your question, Nick?
Great. Thanks, Chloe. Thanks for the great questions. I will leave questions open for a few more minutes here. And then depending on what we get in the chat, or if anyone has questions they'd like to ask, we'll go ahead and wrap up for the day. I'm going to go ahead and put my email in the chat, even though you probably all have it and can find it other places, but I'm going to go ahead and do that. And all of our emails follow a similar naming convention, so you can find Jordan or myself that way. Again, Elizabeth and Shelby are also here to coordinate meetings. If you need a sign up for a pre-application call, but those specific technical questions, send those my way, but we can definitely, anyone on the team can coordinate getting your questions answered and getting you a time to chat if necessary. All right, I'm going to give just another minute because it's 11:29. We'll give it till 11:30 to see if there are any questions. But thank you all so much for your time this morning. This recording, as soon as it's processed and we'll get it up on the website. If you need to reference it, again, reach out to myself, reference the guidelines, and yeah, good luck applying, and please let us know if you have any other questions. All right, I'm going to go ahead, stop recording. Everyone have a great day, and